Welcome back to Morgan's video blog with writing tips from the pros and, of course, my own writerly musings. Today, I'm here to share with you creating new mythologies from hidden histories, a DisConIII panel. The panelists were Rosanna Brown, Cherie Renee Thomas, Andrea Hairston, and Carlo Yeager Rodriguez. The moderator was Ada Palmer. The panel description was as follows. One of the astounding things about the internet has been the way historians, both amateur and professional, have used it to research, write, and make available histories that have not been accessible before. Histories of marginalized, oppressed, sidelined, and disappeared are now available as the stuff of story. This panel will discuss the pleasures, possibilities, and pitfalls of the new quote unquote true stories writers are discovering and using. As a note, when we discuss quote unquote hidden histories, think about who they were hidden from and who knew the histories and stories all along. First up, let's talk about where do you find these? Where do you find histories that weren't in your textbook? You can check out oral stories on YouTube and TikTok, etc. There is the Storymobile and listening labs. Local NPR stations and local colleges often have this sort of thing. You can look at old post-copyright stuff that are being released on Kindle, although I'll talk a little more about that. There is the Hidden Histories series, Lies My Teacher Told Me by James W. Lowen, War Against All Puerto Ricans, Revolution and Terror in America's Colony by Nelson A. Dennis, 1N, Discourse on Colonialism by Amy Césaire, and you can take literal exchange trips to different countries. And of course, there's Macmillan's remixed classics. So when you're looking at these different sources, you need to contextualize them to really understand where the writer's coming from and how the culture is being processed and filtered through a lens. For oral traditions, look at who is telling the story and what class they are in their culture, how they fit into that society. For post-copyright books, as promised, some are being uploaded to Kindle with the new release date. So pay attention to how old the book really is and not just the Kindle assumed publication date. Do note that a lot of stuff has been disproven in the last 100 years, and up-to-date stuff is very often behind academic paywalls. From the mid-1800s, accounts you can find are usually very encyclopedic, but of course with the writer biases. From the early 1900s, you're going to see things that historians were praised for quote unquote cleaning up history. So those aren't going to be as accurate, but they should give you some insight into what America wanted to promote at that time. And another source is historically Germans journaled very thorough records of many African cultures. You can find journals of descriptions of dances, ceremonies, drawings, descriptions of public intimate encounters, etc. So when you're reading these historical accounts, you need to look for the gaps. What isn't being described or discussed? Often due to cultural judgment by the recorder or privacy demands from the members of the culture being observed. Remember that history isn't necessarily written by the winners, often it's reinterpreted by those with political agendas. The French version versus the British version versus the indigenous groups version are going to be three very different things. When you look at our textbooks versus the true hidden histories, you're going to notice a lack in the textbooks. You're going to see who the colonizers were, but very often not the societies that were colonized. I can tell you which countries in South America were settled by the Portuguese or the Spanish or the British, but I don't know the names of the people who were there first. I mean, I might be able to look it up. I think I've got Aztecs, Incans, and that's it. Another thing about the colonizers is they wiped out many groups, but sometimes they just claimed annihilation so they could claim the land. Puerto Rico's colonizers claimed annihilation to the Spanish crown so they could just take the whole thing over. Be wary of misinformation. Just because there are sources or these sources are old doesn't mean they're right. Roman records of their conquered lands were often biased or plain wrong, and they were far from the first or the last. See who wrote the sources and where they got their information from. If they all cite the same source, see if you can verify the veracity of that source. Think about how Germany actively teaches the Holocaust. They take their children to the sites, they criminally prosecute anyone who tries to erase it. But we don't often hear about their dress rehearsal in Southwest Africa's Namibia of the Herero and the Nama people between 1904 and 1907. Sometimes who the who was being destroyed isn't even a footnote. And remember that many colonized or conquered people often hid their beliefs in variations of the colonizer's predominant religion. So let's talk about who gets to use these histories and tales. Africa so often gets talked about in so-called Western culture as though it's one big nation, when it's the second largest continent on this planet. With 55 nations and one principality, it has thousands of languages and cultures and peoples. There is also a huge backlash these days about misappropriation against smaller writers and writers from other cultures. And then there's Neil Gaiman with Anansi Boys, which I liked, but I don't know about the authenticity. That's not my culture, and it's clearly being filtered through his, British lens. Andrea Hairston from the panel told us about how she'd built a relationship and was allowed to see the Gula Geechee dances on Sapelo Island, Georgia. The people there also followed their Western African ancestors' tradition of grave offerings, things that are said to contain the spirit of the past. A beloved pipe or cup or spoon or book, something that the past on relative loved. These days, the mourners have to hide both the graves and the offerings to keep tourists from taking them home as souvenirs. Andrea Hairston also studies material culture. She's building a costume library and now has boxes and boxes of authentic, true dresses and clothes that people wore in different eras for different occasions. Do remember when you think about who gets to use these histories and tales that there is a power in choosing not to share important things with outsiders. While anthropologists might shudder, a culture belongs to its people in its own context and is not owed to anyone else. That said, let's talk about a few ways to use these quote-unquote hidden histories in your writing. Number one, research, research, research. I think that's pretty obvious. Number two, do your due diligence, especially for real religions or their myths. Number three, if an adaptation is popular with like neo-Nazis or another hate group, see if there's another interpretation and maybe not associate yourself with that group. And finally, be careful about the lens you use to tell the story. Be sure to give agency to the characters from the culture whose stories you are telling. As always, if you have any doubts, reach out, get a sensitivity reader, or if the story isn't yours to tell, maybe tell a different story. Thank you for watching, and tune in again next week for more writing tips and writerly musings. Let me know in the comments below if I missed any tips or if you have any of your own. And I'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.